Welcome to the dimmed light. Before we step into the ancient past, I invite you to pause for a moment. Where are you right now? Is the moon casting a silver glow on your window? Or are you listening to the quiet rhythm of the rain? Let me know in the comments below. I always find peace in knowing we are resting together across the world. If you haven't already, please subscribe and turn on notifications to join our journey through time. Now, take a deep, slow breath. Unclench your jaw. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears and imagine the heaviness of the day melting into the ground. There is nothing you need to remember right now. There is no list to check, no message to answer. Tonight, we are going to a place where memory was invented. We are traveling back 5,000 years to the banks of the Euphrates River, where the mud is cool and the world is waiting to be written. Close your eyes and let the river carry you. The sun hung low over the city of Uruk, casting long, stretching shadows across the mud, brick walls. It was the season of the harvest, and the air was thick with the smell of dry wheat and heated dust. Inside the great temple complex of Inna, the noise of the day was beginning to fade, but the work was far from over. En-Kulaba stood in the center of the royal storehouse. He was young, his hands were calloused, and his mind was tired. Around him rose mountains of abundance. To his left, hundreds of large clay jars filled with barley beer were stacked in precarious rows. To his right, baskets of wool sheared from the temple flocks were piled so high they nearly touched the cedar beams of the ceiling. En-Kulaba closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the silence that was slowly settling over the room. He felt the immense weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. It was his duty to remember. He had to remember how many jars had arrived from the northern fields. He had to remember how many sacks of grain were owed to the bakers. He had to remember which shepherd had brought the black wool and which had brought the white. But his memory was like a cup that was too full. It was spilling over. He opened his eyes and looked at the jars again. He tried to count them. 1, 2, 3, 10, 20. His gaze drifted. Was it 20? Or 21? The numbers slipped away from him like water through fingers. He sighed, a soft sound that was lost in the vastness of the room. He walked slowly towards a stack of baskets. He reached out and touched the woven reeds. The texture was rough and dry under his fingertips. He could smell the lanolin from the raw wool, a heavy, animal scent. The world was made of objects, heavy, real, tangible objects. But the mind was made of mist. How could he make the mist hold the objects? He paced the floor, his bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. The floor was cool, contrasting with the heat that still radiated from the walls. He stopped by the open doorway. Outside, the great Euphrates River flowed silently, a ribbon of life in the desert. He watched the water move. It never stopped. It carried the silt, the mud, the life of the land. En-Kulaba felt a strange longing. He wished his thoughts could be as solid as the riverbank. He wished he could freeze the numbers in time, just as the winter froze the puddles. He looked back into the storehouse. The shadows were growing deeper now, hiding the jars in gloom. The chaos of the inventory seemed to mock him. There were too many things, too many transactions. The old ways of using small stone tokens were not enough anymore. The tokens got lost. The tokens got mixed up. He needed something else. He needed a surface. He needed a way to catch the voice and hold it still. He rubbed his temples, feeling the pulse of his own blood. The heat of the day lingered in the stone, but a cool breeze was starting to drift in from the river. It carried the scent of wet earth, the scent of clay. En-Kulaba paused. Clay. The city was built of it. The walls were made of it. The jars were shaped from it. It was the flesh of the earth. He looked down at his own hands. They were empty now, but they knew the feel of the mud. He remembered playing by the riverbank as a child. He remembered how his footprints remained in the mud long after he had walked away. A footprint, a mark, a memory left in the earth. The thought bloomed in his mind, slow and quiet, like a lotus opening at dawn. If a foot could leave a mark, why not a hand? Why not a tool? Why not a thought? He turned away from the piles of grain. He turned away from the confusion of the numbers. He walked out of the storehouse, stepping into the twilight. He did not go to his sleeping mat. He did not go to the dining hall. He walked towards the river. His steps were slow and deliberate. He was drawn by the water, drawn by the mud. He was going to find the answer in the earth itself. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, watching him. They were points of light, fixed and eternal. En-Kulaba wanted to make his own stars. He wanted to make stars of meaning in the clay. And so, he descended the stone steps to the water's edge. The air by the river was heavy with moisture, a stark change from the dry heat of the temple. En-Kulaba knelt on the bank of the Euphrates. The reeds towered above him, swaying gently in the evening breeze. Rustle. Hush. Rustle. They whispered secrets to each other, ancient songs of the wind. He lowered his hands towards the water. He hesitated for a moment, watching his own reflection ripple and distort in the current. Then he broke the surface. His hands sank into the coolness. The water embraced his skin, washing away the sweat and dust of the day. He pushed deeper, past the silt, past the loose sand, until his fingers found the riverbed. There it was, the clay. It was dense, sticky, and cold. He dug his fingers into it, feeling the resistance. It made a soft sucking sound as he pulled a handful free. Squelch. He lifted the clump of mud into the twilight air. It was heavy, dripping with river water. It was raw, chaotic, and unformed. En-Kulaba sat back on his heels, holding the earth in his palms. He began to work it. He squeezed his hands together, compressing the mud. Water trickled down his wrists, cool and ticklish. He needed the clay to be pure. He felt a small pebble inside the mass. He carefully picked it out and tossed it back into the river. Plop! He felt a piece of grit. He removed that too. He wanted only the smooth, yielding flesh of the earth. He rolled the clay between his palms, round and round. The motion was soothing, rhythmic. The clay began to warm slightly from his body heat. It became more pliable, more obedient. It was no longer just mud. It was becoming a possibility. En-Kulaba looked at the ball of clay. It was gray, the color of a storm cloud. It was silent. He placed it on a flat stone beside him. He pressed down on it with the heel of his hand. Gently, evenly. The ball flattened. It expanded outwards, forming a thick, square cushion. He smoothed the edges with his thumb, erasing the cracks. Round the corners, flattened the face. He wetted his finger with river water and polished the surface. Back and forth. The clay became slick and shiny, like a mirror of mud. It sat there on the stone, a perfect, blank rectangle. It was small enough to fit in his hand, yet large enough to hold a world. En-Kulaba wiped his hands on his linen skirt, leaving dark streaks. He looked at the tablet. It was waiting. It was a listener that would never interrupt. But he needed a tongue for it. He turned his gaze to the reeds growing at the water's edge. Calamus, the giant reeds of the marsh. He reached out and selected a strong, straight stalk. It was green and fibrous. He gripped it near the base. He pulled sharply. Snap! The sound was crisp and sudden in the quiet evening. He held the broken reed. He examined the end. It was jagged, fibrous, useless for his purpose. He needed a clean edge. He took a small flint knife from his belt. He held the reed steady. With a precise, angled cut, he sliced the end of the reed. The knife shore through the plant matter cleanly. He looked at the tip. It was a perfect triangle, a wedge, sharp, defined, geometric. He ran his thumb lightly over the cut. It was hard enough to make a mark, but smooth enough not to tear the clay. En-Kulaba held the reed in his right hand. He held the clay tablet in his left, the tool and the medium, the active and the passive. The sky above was now a deep, velvety blue. The first crickets began to chirp in the grass. The river continued its endless flow, indifferent to the man on the bank. But En-Kulaba felt a tremor of excitement in his chest. He was holding a revolution. He was holding the power to freeze time. He looked at the smooth, wet surface of the clay. It was flawless, a blank page in a world of noise. He took a deep breath of the cool river air. He was ready to make the first mark. He was ready to speak without a voice. The clay tablet lay in En-Kulaba's left palm, cool and heavy. It was a small, square universe waiting to be born. The surface was perfectly smooth, reflecting the faint light of the rising moon. En-Kulaba held the cut reed in his right hand. He held it not like a weapon, but like a bird, firmly enough to control it, gently enough not to crush it. He looked at the tablet. What should be the first mark? What was the most important thing in Uruk? It was not the king. It was not the walls. It was the grain, barley, the life blood of the people, the gold of the fields. Without the grain, there was no beer, no bread, no life. He closed his eyes and visualized a stalk of barley. He saw the long, slender stem. He saw the heavy head bowing under the weight of the seeds. He saw the spiky hairs reaching up to the sun. He opened his eyes. He brought the sharp, triangular tip of the reed down to the clay. He hesitated for a heartbeat. Then he pressed. The motion was small, barely a twitch of the wrist. The reed sank into the wet earth. It met a soft resistance, like pushing a finger into dough. There was no sound, just a feeling of displacement. The clay yielded. En-Kulaba lifted the reed. He looked at what he had done. There, on the smooth gray surface, was a mark. It was not a drawing. It was not a picture like the painters made on pottery. It was a clean, sharp impression. A wedge, wide at the top, tapering to a thin point at the bottom. It caught the shadow of the moonlight, standing out dark against the gray. It looked permanent. He pressed the reed again, just below the first mark, and again, and again. He created a central line, the stem. Then he tilted the reed. He used the corner of the tip to make smaller, diagonal wedges branching off the stem. Press, pressed, lift, press, lift. The rhythm was intoxicating. It was faster than drawing. It was cleaner than painting. It was writing. He looked at the finished symbol. It was simple, abstract, but anyone who looked at it would know. This is barley. He felt a sudden rush of vertigo. He was holding a stalk of barley in his hand, but his hand was empty of grain. He had captured the idea of the barley. He had taken the physical object from the storehouse and trapped its soul in the mud. He looked at the river flowing by. The water would dry up. The real barley in the fields would be eaten or would rot. But this mark would stay. As long as the clay was hard, this barley would exist. En-Kulaba touched the mark gently with his fingertip, careful not to smudge it. He felt the ridges of the impression. He felt the shadow he had carved. A smile touched his lips, a secret smile in the darkness. He realized he didn't just have barley. He could have anything. He could capture the sheep. He could capture the jars of beer. He could capture the stars. He could capture the name of the king. The world was vast and fleeing, but with this reed and this mud, he could pin it down. He could make it stay. He looked at the remaining smooth space on the tablet. It was inviting him. It was hungry for more marks. The anxiety of the storehouse, the fear of forgetting, the chaos of the numbers. It all vanished. There was only the reed, the clay, and the wedge. The night air grew colder, but En-Kulaba didn't feel it. He was warmed by the fire of discovery. He turned the tablet slightly in his hand to catch the moonlight better. He prepared to make the next sign, the sign for 10, a number, a quantity, a truth that could not be argued with. He pressed the reed deep. The wedge appeared, and history began. En-Kulaba stood up from the riverbank, his knees stiff from kneeling in the mud. The night had fully descended upon Uruk. The air was cool now, a welcome relief from the baking heat of the day. He held the tablet in his left hand, cradling it against his chest as if it were a wounded bird. It was still damp, still vulnerable. One wrong move, one stumble, and the barley would be erased, returning to formless mud. He began the walk back to the temple complex. The path was narrow, winding through the reed marshes before reaching the city walls. His bare feet moved silently on the beaten earth. The crickets fell silent as he passed, then resumed their song behind him. He felt a strange separation from the world around him. He looked at the distant lights of the city. Small oil lamps flickered in the windows of the mud, brick houses. Behind those walls, people were eating, sleeping, telling stories. They lived in the moment. They spoke words that vanished into the air as soon as they were uttered. En-Kulaba held something different. He held a word that did not die. He reached the great outer gate of the Enna precinct. The walls towered above him, massive and imposing. They were decorated with thousands of clay cones, dipped in red, black, and white paint. In the daylight, they formed dazzling geometric patterns. But now, in the dim light of the gatekeeper's torch, they looked like the scales of a giant serpent. The guard was leaning against the wall, half asleep. He barely glanced at En-Kulaba. To the guard, he was just a young scribe returning late from a walk. He did not know that the man passing him was carrying the end of the prehistoric age. En-Kulaba slipped past the gate into the sacred courtyard. The noise of the river faded, replaced by the heavy, stone silence of the temple. The courtyard was vast and empty. Moonlight washed over the limestone pavement, turning it into a sea of pale silver. En-Kulaba's shadow stretched long and thin across the stones. He walked towards the storehouse. His heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm. He felt like an intruder in his own workplace. He was bringing a new magic into the house of the old gods. He reached the door of the storehouse. It was still open, just as he had left it. He stepped inside. The smell hit him instantly. The warm, dusty scent of grain and wool. But now, the smell didn't feel oppressive. It felt like raw material waiting to be cataloged. He walked to the center of the room, where the moonlight filtered through the high windows. He looked at the chaotic piles of jars. He looked at the tablet in his hand. The wedge-shaped mark of the barley caught the light. It was sharp. It was clear. It was an anchor in the storm of objects. The clay was beginning to change texture. The surface was losing its wet sheen. It was becoming matte, turning to a lighter shade of gray as it dried. It was hardening. The thought became matter. En-Kulaba felt a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion. The mental energy required to invent the sign had drained him, but he could not let go of the tablet yet. He needed a place to put it, a safe place. He walked to a low wooden shelf in the corner, away from the heavy sacks. He brushed away a layer of dust with his elbow. Gently, with infinite care, he lowered the tablet onto the wood. He withdrew his hand slowly. The tablet sat there, alone, silent. It was the first book in the first library of the world. En-Kulaba stood over it, watching. He was afraid that if he looked away, the mark would disappear. But it stayed. The barley remained barley. The 10 remained 10. He let out a long breath, his shoulders dropping. The tension of the harvest, the fear of the inventory, it all drifted away. He had found the solution. Tomorrow, he would make more. Tomorrow, he would teach the others. But for tonight, the secret belonged only to him and the moon. He turned away from the shelf. He walked to his sleeping mat in the corner of the room. He lay down on the woven reeds. The ground was hard, but it felt supportive. He closed his eyes. But in the darkness behind his eyelids, he did not see sheep or grain. He saw wedges, lines and triangles floating in the dark, connecting, building, speaking. The silence of the storehouse was deep and heavy, but to En-Kulaba it was no longer empty. It was waiting to be written. The morning did not come gently to Uruk. It arrived with the blare of a ram's horn from the top of the ziggurat. Ba-room. The sound vibrated through the mud, brick walls of the temple complex, waking the priests, the servants, and the scribes. En-Kulaba opened his eyes. For a moment, he lay still on his reed mat, disoriented by the morning light. He stared at the ceiling beams, listening to the waking sounds of the storehouse, the scuff of sandals on earth, the bleating of goats waiting to be counted, the distant clatter of pottery. Then memory rushed back to him. The river, the mud, the reed, the mark. He sat up quickly, his heart giving a sudden jolt. Had it been a dream? Or worse, had the clay cracked? Had it melted back into a shapeless lump in the night? He threw off his linen covering and stood up. He did not stop to wash his face or straighten his skirt. He walked across the room to the wooden shelf in the corner. The sun was already streaming through the high window, cutting a path through the dusty air. The beam of light fell directly on the shelf, and there it was, the tablet, but it looked different now. Yesterday, in the twilight, it had been dark, glistening and wet. It had looked like a piece of the river. Now it was pale. It was a soft, chalky gray, almost the color of bone. The wet sheen was gone, replaced by a matte, dry finish. En-Kulaba reached out his hand, but he stopped inches before touching it. He was afraid. If he touched it, would it crumble? He took a breath and extended his index finger. He tapped the surface of the clay. Tink! The sound was small, but it was distinct. It was not the squelch of mud. It was the sound of a stone. It was the sound of something solid. He picked it up. It felt lighter than before. The water had left it, evaporated into the air, leaving only the earth behind. But it also felt stronger. He pressed his thumb against the corner, hard. Yesterday, this pressure would have dented the clay, ruining the shape. Today, the clay resisted. His thumb turned white with the pressure, but the tablet did not yield. It pushed back. It was stubborn. It was fixed. En-Kulaba ran his fingertip over the mark of the barley. The edges of the wedge were sharp. They scraped against his skin, defined and crisp. The shadow inside the wedge was deep and permanent. He realized with a shock that he could not change it now, even if he wanted to. He could not erase the barley. He could not smooth it over with his thumb. To change it, he would have to break it. The thought was solid. The memory was frozen. He looked around the busy storehouse. Other scribes were entering, carrying their counting tokens and their baskets. They looked tired, already overwhelmed by the day's tasks. They were preparing to hold the numbers in their heads, to struggle against the tide of forgetfulness. En-Kulaba looked down at the pale gray stone in his hand. He held the anchor. He held the answer. He walked towards the open door into the full brightness of the morning. He held the tablet up to the sun. The light filled the wedge, shaped grooves, making the sign of the barley glow. It was a new kind of sun, a sun of knowledge. A passing priest stopped and looked at him curiously. "What do you have there, En-Kulaba?" The priest asked, squinting against the glare. "Is it a cake of dried mud?" En-Kulaba lowered his hand and looked at the priest. He smiled, a smile that went all the way to his eyes. "No," he said softly. "It is a granary." The priest frowned, confused, and walked away. En-Kulaba turned the tablet over in his hands. The back was smooth and blank. It was waiting. There was so much more to write. The sheep, the oil, the beer, the prayers, the stories. The clay was ready. The reed was ready. And now the scribe was ready. He walked back into the storehouse, not to the grain piles, but to the water jar to wet his hands. He would need more mud. He would need much more mud. The age of the voice was ending. The age of the tablet had begun. The sun was high now, and the storehouse was a hive of activity. The air was thick with the noise of bleating goats, shouting porters, and the scratching of rough sandals on the floor. In the center of this chaos stood Nanshi, the chief overseer of the granary. He was an old man, his back bent like a willow branch from years of counting. His hands were full of small stone tokens, little cones and spheres representing the day's intake. He was muttering to himself, a frantic stream of numbers. 16, 17, no, was it 18? A porter dropped a sack of grain nearby with a heavy thud, and Nanshi flinched. The stones slipped from his sweaty palm. They scattered onto the dusty floor, rolling in every direction. The old man let out a cry of despair. "Gone," he whispered. "The count is gone." He fell to his knees, scrabbling in the dirt, trying to retrieve the tokens, but they were mixed with the gravel. The memory of the morning's work was lost. En-Kulaba watched from the shadows. He felt a pang of pity, but also a surge of certainty. He stepped forward. He walked through the cloud of dust to where the old man knelt. "Master Nanshi," he said softly. The old man looked up, his eyes red with stress and dust. "Leave me, boy. I must start again. I must count every sack again." "You do not need to count again," En-Kulaba said. He reached into the fold of his skirt and pulled out the pale gray tablet. He held it out. Nanshi stared at it, confused. "What is this?" "A tile, a toy." "It is the barley," En-Kulaba said, "from the northern field." The old man scoffed, pushing himself up to stand. "Do not mock me. Barley is gold and heavy. This is dry mud. Look closer." En-Kulaba urged, holding the tablet steady. Nanshi sighed, wiping his hands on his tunic. He leaned in, squinting his failing eyes against the light. He saw the marks, the deep, shadowed wedges, the central line, the branching diagonals. He blinked. He looked at the sacks of grain stacked behind him. Then he looked back at the clay. The shape, it mimicked the shape of the plant. It was not the plant, but it was the shadow of the plant. "It looks like a stalk," the old man whispered, his voice trembling. "It is," En-Kulaba replied. "And look here." He pointed to the two circular depressions he had made next to the barley sign. 2 circles, 2 tens, 20. Nanshi stared. His mind, trained for decades to hold abstract numbers, suddenly locked onto the concrete image. 20? Barley. He didn't need to remember it. It was right there, held in the young man's hand. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His mouth opened slightly. He reached out a shaking hand and took the tablet. It was light, cool, solid. He ran his thumb over the grooves, just as En-Kulaba had done. "It stays." Nanshi asked, his voice barely audible above the noise of the goats. "It stays," En-Kulaba confirmed. "It does not roll away like the stones. It does not rot like the wood. The old man looked up at En-Kulaba. The annoyance was gone from his face. In its place was a look of profound relief, mixed with a kind of fear. He realized that his life of endless memorization was over. He realized that this piece of mud knew more than he did. "Show me." Nancy said. It was a command, but it was also a plea. En-Kulaba smiled. He led the old man to his corner. He picked up a fresh lump of wet clay he had prepared. He handed Nancy the reed stylus. "Hold it like a bird," En-Kulaba whispered. Nancy's hand was clumsy at first. He was used to gripping heavy sacks, not delicate reeds. He pressed the stylus into the wet clay. Squish! The mark was too deep, too messy. Gently, En-Kulaba guided. "Let the clay invite you in." Nancy tried again. Better. A wedge appeared. Then another. The old man giggled. It was a sound En-Kulaba had never heard. The giggle of a child discovering a new game. "I have made a sheep." Nancy declared, pointing to a clumsy cross shape he had invented on the spot. "You have." En-Kulaba agreed. The two scribes stood together in the dusty sunbeam. Around them, the storehouse continued its noisy, chaotic business. But in that quiet corner, the world had changed. Information had passed from one mind to another through a piece of earth. They were no longer just men. They were readers. The corner of the storehouse was no longer a place of dust and forgotten things. It had become a sanctuary of earth. Kulaba and Nancy sat opposite each other on low stools, a heavy stone slab between them. The sun was warm on their backs, but the clay in front of them was cool and wet. They were not writing today. Today was for preparation. Before the mind could speak, the hand had to build the canvas. En-Kulaba reached into a large ceramic bowl filled with river mud. He pulled out a heavy, dripping mass. Squelch. He threw it onto the stone slab. Thwack. The sound was satisfyingly dull and heavy. He began to knead. He pushed the heel of his hand into the gray mass, stretching it out. Then he folded it back over itself. Push. Fold. Push. Fold. It was the same motion the bakers used for the bread in the royal ovens. But this dough would feed the mind, not the stomach. The rhythm took over the room. En-Kulaba worked in silence. His breathing synchronized with his hands. He had to get the air out. If there were bubbles of air trapped inside, the tablet would crack when it dried. It had to be dense, solid, uniform. He felt a small pocket of air pop under his palm. Snap. Good. Nancy, despite his age, worked with a steady, rocking motion. The old man found peace in the repetition. His hands, once trembling with the stress of numbers, were now steady with the purpose of creation. It is like holding a sleeping animal. Nancy murmured, patting his lump of clay into a round shape. It is taming the river. Kulaba replied softly. He took his wire cutter. a taut string of gut, and sliced through the kneaded clay. He checked the cross-section. Smooth, gray, perfect. He slammed the two halves back together and pounded them into a square. He used a flat wooden paddle to beat the sides. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. The edges became straight. The corners became sharp. He placed the finished blank tablet on the drying rack. It joined a row of 10 others. They sat there, identical and waiting, like soldiers in a silent army, like pillows for the god's dreams. En-Kulaba looked at the shelves. A week ago, there was nothing. Now, there were rows of gray rectangles. Some were already covered in wedge marks, drying into stone. Others were dark and wet, waiting for the stylus. The chaos of the temple was being absorbed into these squares. The sheep were no longer bleeding in En-Kulaba's head. They were sleeping safely in the clay. The jars of oil were not leaking in his memory. They were sealed in the mud. The room smelled of wet earth and drying silt. It was a primal smell, the smell of creation. En-Kulaba wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. His hands were coated in a fine glove of gray slip. He felt a deep, grounding connection to the ground beneath his feet. He was making the earth speak. He picked up another lump of raw mud. Thwack. The rhythm began again. Push, fold, push, fold. Outside, the city of Uruk roared with life. But inside, there was only the sound of the clay being shaped into eternity. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into a season. The corner of the storehouse had transformed. It was no longer just a workspace. It had become a fortress. En-Kulaba stood before the wooden shelves he had built. They rose from the floor to the height of his chest, sturdy and smelling of cedar. But it was not the wood that mattered. It was what the wood held. Row after row of clay tablets, hundreds of them. They sat there in perfect silence, a motionless army of memory. En-Kulaba walked slowly down the line, his hands clasped behind his back. He did not need to touch them to know what they said. He knew the shape of every wedge, the curve of every line. Here, on the top shelf, were the grain harvests of the last moon. Every basket, every sack, every bushel was trapped in the clay. Below them were the herds, the sheep, the goats, the cattle. Their bleating had faded into the desert wind, but their numbers were locked here, safe from the wolves of forgetfulness. On the bottom shelf were the jars of oil and beer. En-Kulaba paused. He remembered the panic he used to feel, the sleepless nights, wondering if he had forgotten a shipment, the fear of the high priest's anger. That fear was gone. It had evaporated like the water from the mud. He felt a lightness in his head, a clarity he had never known before. His mind was empty, quiet, and peaceful, because the shelves remembered for him. He reached out and picked up one of the oldest tablets. It was fully dry now. It was as hard as a river stone, pale and chalky to the touch. He tapped it with his fingernail. Click! It was a sound of durability. If he dropped this tablet, it might chip, but the words would remain. If the roof collapsed, the tablets would wait in the rubble. If En-Kulaba died tomorrow, another scribe could pick this up in 1,000 years and know exactly how many sheep were in the temple on this day. The thought sent a shiver through him. He was not just counting sheep. He was defeating time. He was building a bridge across the river of death. The sunlight shifted, filtering through the dust motes dancing in the air. The shadows of the wedges deepened. The script looked almost alive, a language of light and shadow. Nancy shuffled into the aisle, carrying a fresh batch of wet tablets. The old man moved with a new energy. He no longer looked burdened. He placed the wet clay on the drying rack with a gentle thud. "The shepherds are here." Nancy said softly. "They brought 30 lambs." En-Kulaba nodded. "We will catch them," he said. He picked up his stylus. He did not sigh. He did not worry. He simply walked to the fresh clay. The system was working. The chaos of the world, the births, the deaths, the floods, the trades, all of it flowed into this room. And here it was tamed. It was ordered. It was stacked on shelves, dried by the sun, and kept safe. En-Kulaba looked at the wall of tablets one last time before starting his work. It was a library of silence. But to him, it was the loudest place on earth. It was the voice of Uruk, echoing into eternity. The heat of the day did not fade slowly this evening. It was broken. The sky over Uruk turned the color of a bruised plum, heavy and swollen. The wind picked up, swirling the dust in the courtyard into dancing spirals. Whoosh! It whistled through the gaps in the brickwork, a low, mournful song. En-Kulaba stood at the door of the storehouse. He watched the palm trees bending low, bowing to the approaching power. The birds had gone silent. The goats had huddled together in their pens. Then the first drop fell. Splat! It hit the dry earth like a heavy coin. Then another, and another. And then the heavens opened. The rain came down not as drops, but as a sheet of water. It hammered against the city walls. It turned the dust into instant mud. En-Kulaba stepped back and pulled the heavy cedar door shut. Thud! He dropped the wooden bar into place. Clack! The roar of the storm was instantly muffled. It became a distant drumming, a rhythmic percussion on the flat roof above. Inside, the air was still and dry. En-Kulaba lit a small oil lamp. The flame flickered for a moment, then steadied, casting a warm, golden circle of light. He turned to look at his domain. The shelves, the fortress of memory. Outside, the rain was washing away the footprints of the day. It was dissolving the unbaked bricks of the poor. It was turning the paths into rivers. Nature was reclaiming its territory, erasing the marks of man. But here, the memory was safe. En-Kulaba walked slowly down the aisle of shelves, holding the lamp high. The light danced over the rows of gray tablets. They were dry. They were hard. The dampness of the storm could not touch them. He felt a profound sense of protection. It was not just the grain he was guarding anymore. He was guarding the truth. A clap of thunder shook the ground. Bo-om! Dust trickled from the ceiling beams. En-Kulaba didn't flinch. He reached out and touched a tablet on the nearest shelf. It was cool and solid under his fingers. "You are safe," he whispered to the clay. He imagined the chaos outside, the river rising, the farmers running for cover, the confusion of the dark. But in this room there was order. 20 sheep, 10 jars, 3 days. The facts remained unchanged by the weather. En-Kulaba pulled a small stool to the center of the room. He sat down, wrapping his linen cloak tighter around his shoulders against the draft. He listened to the rain. Drum, drum, drum. It was a hypnotic sound. It made the silence inside feel deeper, richer. He picked up a tablet he had written earlier that day. He traced the wedges with his eyes. He read the story of the harvest. The storm could rage all night. It could flood the fields. It could wash away the roads. But it could not wash away this harvest. The barley was harvested in the clay, and here it would remain forever. En-Kulaba felt a heavy, warm drowsiness settle into his bones. The adrenaline of the storm had faded, leaving behind a deep peace. He was the keeper of the shelter. He was the guardian of the dry ground. The lamp burned low, the oil level dropping slowly. The shadows in the corners grew softer, fuzzy at the edges. The thunder moved further away, rolling like distant drums. The rain softened to a steady, gentle patter. Tap, tap, tap. It was a lullaby. En-Kulaba leaned his head back against a wooden post. He watched the rows of tablets one last time. They looked like sleeping children tucked into their beds. The world outside was fluid and fleeing. The world inside was fixed and eternal, and in that balance between the storm and the stone, the scribe found his rest. The oil in the small lamp finally runs dry. The flame sputters once, twice, and then vanishes into a thin wisp of smoke. Darkness reclaims the storehouse, but it is a soft, velvety darkness. En-Kulaba does not feel the need to light another lamp. His work is done. The storm outside has passed, leaving only the rhythmic dripping of water from the roof eaves. Drip, drip, drip. It is the heartbeat of the earth. En-Kulaba lies down on his woven mat, pulling the linen sheet up to his chin. His body is heavy, sinking into the support of the ground. His hands, stained gray with the clay of creation, rest open and loose at his sides. His fingers, which held the weight of the harvest all day, are finally still. He closes his eyes. In the quiet dark, he can still smell the wet earth, the cedar wood, and the rain. He thinks of the shelves standing guard in the blackness. He thinks of the barley, the sheep, and the kings, all sleeping safely in the stone. He does not need to worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow is already written. And now, En-Kulaba, the first scribe, lets go of the world. He drifts away, carried by the invisible river of sleep, towards a place where no memory is ever lost. And you, dear traveler of time, the storehouse is closed for you as well. The reed is laid down. The clay is set to dry. The history of the world is safe. You do not need to carry it anymore. Like the scribe, you have done enough for today. Let the tension drain from your shoulders. Let your hands be empty. Let your mind be as smooth and quiet as a fresh tablet of clay. The river flows on, endless and deep. Let it carry you into the silence, into the peace, into the deep, dreamless dark. Good night.